In October of 2021, after months of unrelenting stress and the growing sense that I'd become a stranger in my own routine, I made the decision to remove myself from everything familiar and retreat into silence, choosing to spend a few days entirely alone in a remote farmhouse I had discovered on a vacation rental platform. The listing itself had been modest, the photos neither polished nor curated for effect. But there was something about the place. A weathered two-story house surrounded by open fields, a gravel drive disappearing into a windbreak, and the kind of emptiness that made your shoulders drop just looking at it. That had spoken to a part of me I hadn't realized was desperate for stillness. The host had described the house as a century-old family farmhouse, carefully maintained and intentionally rustic, with the expected nods to modern comforts such as electricity, running water, and Wi-Fi. Though there was a clear note indicating that the second floor of the home was off-limits to guests and used solely for long-term storage, a boundary that seemed completely reasonable at the time. The drive out from the city was long and uneventful, a slow unraveling of urban noise and motion until only the hum of tires on cracked two-lane roads and the occasional blur of farmland remained. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the horizon was beginning to pull the sun downward, and the light across the fields had taken on that peculiar amber quality that makes everything appear older and softer than it really is. The house stood alone in the middle of it all, distant from any other structures or signs of habitation. And while its peeling paint and slightly sagging roofline made it clear that time had moved faster than renovations, it possessed the quiet dignity of something that had stood its ground for over 100 years. The wind moved through the trees around the property, but beyond that, there was no real sound. No traffic, no voices, not even the familiar mechanical hum that always seemed to exist in the background of daily life. Stepping inside, I was met by a wave of still air that smelled faintly of wood, fabric that hadn't been disturbed in months, and something older that I couldn't quite place. A mix of linseed oil, dried mud, and something faintly sweet and rotted like forgotten apples in a cellar. The house had clearly been cleaned for my arrival, though it was evident that it had not been lived in for some time. As each step I took across the uneven wooden floors echoed slightly in the stillness, and every corner of every room seemed to observe me in the way abandoned places do when they aren't quite used to company. The main floor contained everything I would need for the duration of my stay: a functional kitchen, a small dining nook, a cozy, if slightly musty living room, and a bedroom that faced the rear of the property, where the only visible movement came from the shifting of tall grass in the wind. The staircase to the second floor was narrow and steep, its handrail worn smooth and slightly loose at the top. And at the summit was a heavy wooden door with a noticeable inward bow to its frame, likely from years of seasonal expansion and contraction. Taped neatly at eye level was a single sheet of yellowed paper with the words "Storage Locked" printed in all capital letters. The ink slightly faded at the edges, as though it had been taped there for longer than the host might have admitted. I had no reason to question it. In houses this old, it was not uncommon for the upper levels to be structurally unsound or filled with forgotten furniture, boxes, or insulation that had been left undisturbed for decades. That first evening passed without incident. I cooked myself a quiet dinner, choosing simplicity over effort, and spent most of the time sitting near the fireplace with a book that I had brought but never really committed to reading, more focused instead on the sound of the wind brushing against the windows and the creaks that issued softly from the walls as the house settled into the cold. The quiet was profound, Not just the absence of noise, but a sort of enveloping silence that made every breath feel heavier and more noticeable. When I finally went to bed, the mattress was unexpectedly firm, the blankets coarse but clean. And although I found it difficult to fall asleep at first, I attributed that more to the novelty of being alone in a strange, isolated space than to anything inherently wrong or unsettling about the house itself. It was sometime deep into the second night, closer to morning than midnight, when I woke up without understanding why, my body reacting to something before my mind could catch up. The digital clock on my phone glowed softly, the numbers indicating that it was just past 2:30 a.m. And the room was wrapped in complete stillness, the kind that doesn't just mute sound, but seems to press in on your skin. I lay motionless for a few seconds, listening, waiting to discern whether it had been a noise that had stirred me or some unconscious instinct when I heard it. A soft, deliberate series of creaking footsteps above me, each one separated by enough time to suggest intention rather than the random shifting of the building. The weight of the sound, slow and rhythmic, traveled across the ceiling directly above where I lay. And there was a distinct pause after the final step before a sudden, heavy thud struck the floor above, as though something sizable had either fallen or been dropped with force. My body had already tensed by the time the sound registered fully in my mind, and in the heavy silence that followed, I realized that I had stopped breathing, straining to hear anything further, any continued movement, any voice, any sound of a door or latch. But there was nothing, only the deepening sense that something was wrong. It was then that I noticed the smell, subtle at first, but quickly overwhelming, as though something had stirred in the air, along with the sound above. It was the kind of scent that provoked a visceral reaction without needing to be immediately identifiable. Something thick and organic, like rotting vegetation mixed with mold. And beneath it all, a sharp metallic tang that caught in the back of the throat, unmistakably similar to the scent of rusted iron or dried blood. I sat up slowly, my skin damp with sweat despite the chill in the air, and I felt a pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with breathing. I moved carefully through each room on the main floor of the house, checking the windows one by one and testing every lock. Though I couldn't have said exactly what I expected to find, or what I was hoping to rule out, everything was in its place, untouched and undisturbed. There were no open doors, no signs of intrusion, and the wind outside had gone completely still. Yet the sense that something, or someone, had passed through the space above me just moments earlier remained heavy and inescapable. As I stood at the foot of the staircase, looking up toward the closed door that led to the second floor, I had the uneasy impression that although the house looked unchanged, something inside it was not. The silence on the other side of that door didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting. Despite every part of me demanding answers, I couldn't bring myself to go up those stairs. I didn't touch the railing, didn't even take a step in that direction. Instead, I turned on every light in the house, trying to chase away the sense of being watched, and retreated to the living room. I positioned myself in the corner farthest from the staircase, keeping the door to the second floor within view. I stayed like that for hours, too alert to rest, too unsettled to do anything but watch and wait. The house never made another sound. Eventually, the darkness outside gave way to the dim light of morning, filtering through the curtains in cold, pale strips. The strange smell had faded almost entirely by then, though a faint trace of it still clung to the air near the stairs. like the last breath of something that had been sealed away too long. As soon as the sun was fully up, I packed my things and loaded my car, moving through the house with the kind of quiet urgency that comes not from panic, but from instinct. The same instinct that tells you when you've overstayed somewhere you don't belong. I didn't eat, didn't take time to gather my thoughts. I just left. Later that afternoon, once I was back in cell range and parked in a gas station lot just outside a small town, I wrote a message to the host. I kept my wording polite and straightforward. I explained that I had heard strange noises from the second floor during the night and had left early as a result. I asked as casually as I could whether there was any possibility that someone else had access to the property, or if they'd had reports of wildlife getting into the attic. It felt like the kind of question any reasonable guest might ask after an unsettling experience in an old rural home. The reply didn't come until later that evening. It was short and offered no acknowledgement of concern, no follow-up questions. The host wrote that the upper floor had not been accessed in over 10 years, that no one else had been on the property during my stay, and that the house sometimes makes sounds at night. It's an old place, after all. The tone was flat, almost indifferent, and carried the kind of carefully chosen vagueness that made it feel less like a genuine response and more like a line they had sent to other guests before me. I didn't write back. I didn't leave a review. And I never contacted the platform. In the weeks that followed, I checked the listing once or twice out of habit. And I eventually noticed that the part of the description mentioning the locked second floor had been removed entirely, as though it had never existed. I don't think about the farmhouse every day, and I don't tell the story often, not because I'm afraid of being believed or not believed, but because it's difficult to explain something that felt more like a shift in atmosphere than a clear event. Still, every now and then, usually late at night when everything else is quiet, I remember the way it felt standing at the bottom of those stairs, knowing with complete certainty that I wasn't alone, even if no one else ever stepped foot inside that house while I was there. In the autumn of 2018, during a period of my life when I found solace in solitude and creative work, I had taken up the quiet habit of traveling across rural Kentucky in search of abandoned structures to photograph. Places long since left behind by time, where dust and decay had begun to replace the ordinary rhythms of life that once filled them. My interest in these forgotten properties was not born from a desire to seek out anything paranormal or sensational, but rather from a fascination with stillness, an eerie, fragile beauty that revealed itself in the empty chairs, sagging ceilings, and cracked floorboards of homes that once belonged to someone. I remember the farmhouse vividly, not because of its architecture or even its remoteness, but because of what occurred there. An experience that remains difficult to rationalize even years later, and which I have spoken of only sparingly, unsure of how to reconcile what I encountered with anything resembling ordinary explanation. I had found the property while browsing through a series of archived land records and old aerial maps, an idle pursuit that had become second nature to me. The farmhouse in question stood several miles off the nearest road, surrounded on all sides by dense woodland that had long since overtaken any formal driveway or footpath. According to both county records and public utility databases, the house had not received electricity, water, or telephone service since 2007, more than a decade before I first stepped onto the property. I set out on an overcast afternoon with my equipment packed carefully into the back of my Jeep, following a narrowing series of gravel roads and eventually an unmarked dirt trail that wound deep into the forest, the trees pressing close on either side, as if to remind me that I was steadily moving further from the familiar. The path, if it could still be called that, eventually gave way to a faint depression in the ground that hinted at where a driveway might once have been, nearly swallowed by layers of moss, saplings, and leaf rot. At the end of this trail, the house emerged, worn, weathered, and sagging slightly in the middle, as if the earth itself had grown tired of holding it up. The structure, though battered by time and neglect, still possessed the unmistakable shape of a home. A porch lined with rotting floorboards, windows shuttered with grime, and a chimney leaning just slightly off balance. It bore no evidence of recent intrusion or trespass. No tire marks in the soft ground, no graffiti, no discarded beer cans or broken glass that so often plague such places. There was only the silence of deep country, broken occasionally by the distant caw of crows or the rustling of leaves disturbed by wind or wildlife. After taking several preliminary photographs of the exterior, I stepped inside, moving cautiously across the threshold and immediately becoming aware of the way the air changed. A heavy, stagnant stillness settled over everything, laced with the unmistakable scent of mildew, damp wood, and disuse. Dust clung to every surface, rising in faint clouds around my feet, and the only light came in slanted rays through broken blinds and warped window frames. Despite its deterioration, the interior remained remarkably intact. An armchair sagging in the living room beside a bookshelf filled with swollen paperbacks, family portraits hanging askew on the walls, a television set that looked like it hadn't been turned on since the early 2000s. Moving slowly and respectfully, I photographed what I could, pausing now and then to adjust the angle of my lens or steady my tripod on uneven floorboards. Every creak of the old wood beneath my boots echoed faintly through the house, underscoring just how alone I was. Eventually, my exploration brought me into the kitchen, which still bore the remnants of daily life. Rusted silverware in the drawers, ceramic plates stacked in the cabinets, and a calendar from 2007 still hanging on the wall, its pages curled and faded with time. It was there, in that kitchen, that something occurred which I have never been able to fully explain or forget. As I was repositioning my camera near the sink to capture the way the light fell across the chipped countertop, I became aware of a sound so completely out of place in that decaying, powerless structure that I initially believed it must be coming from outside or from some mechanical function I had failed to notice. But no such explanation presented itself, because the sound I heard was the clear, unmistakable ringing of a landline telephone. The noise came from an old rotary wall phone mounted beside the pantry door, its beige plastic body stained with age, the receiver resting securely in its cradle. It rang exactly 4 times, sharp, deliberate, mechanical tones that reverberated through the quiet house in a way that made my stomach turn cold. Every rational part of me resisted what I was hearing, because such a sound should have been impossible in a home with no power, no phone service, and no connection to anything that could facilitate that kind of noise. Driven more by instinct than intention, I reached out and lifted the handset from the cradle, half expecting the sound to continue, or for there to be nothing at all. Instead, the ringing stopped the moment I touched it, replaced not by a dial tone nor by static, but by a complete and total silence, so profound it felt somehow unnatural. I brought the receiver to my ear, unsure what I expected to hear, and for a long moment, there was nothing. No feedback, no hum, no sound of any kind. Then, so faint that I nearly missed it, I heard what I can only describe as the steady, deliberate rhythm of a person breathing on the other end. It wasn't hurried, and it didn't sound garbled or electronic in any way. The breathing that came through the receiver was measured, steady, too deliberate to be mistaken for background noise, too natural to be a mechanical glitch. Whoever was on the other end wasn't speaking. They weren't trying to frighten me with words or theatrics. They were just there, present, listening, as though they'd been waiting for someone to pick up, maybe for a long time. That small, quiet sound, the slow inhale and exhale, was more disturbing than if I'd heard shouting or static. It felt real and alive. I don't know how long I stood there with the phone pressed against my ear, trying to make sense of something that didn't belong. Something that shouldn't have been possible in a house with no working power, no connected utilities, no wires in the walls. Eventually, I set the receiver back into its cradle, doing so carefully, as if sudden movement might tip something over, something I didn't understand and didn't want to provoke. I backed away from the wall, keeping my eyes on that phone for a few seconds longer, unsure whether I expected it to ring again or simply fall off the hook on its own. I left without finishing what I came to do. I didn't take any more photos. I didn't even look in the remaining rooms. I just packed up my gear as fast as I could without fumbling, made my way out of that house, and didn't stop moving until I was back at the tree line. Even then, I felt like I hadn't fully left the place behind. The woods felt thicker, quieter. The air had taken on that strange, almost metallic chill, the kind that doesn't come from the temperature, but from something deeper, harder to define. It felt like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see, and now the place knew I'd seen it. Back in the car, I drove straight out of that area, not stopping until I was back in the sprawl of small towns and cell service and traffic lights. Somewhere normal, somewhere that grounded me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that moment in the kitchen, the way the phone had rung with such certainty, like it had every right to be ringing, like it had always been waiting for someone to answer. In the days that followed, I went back through my notes, the digital maps I'd saved, the coordinates logged on my camera. None of it added up. The satellite view showed a clearing where the house should have been, but no visible structure. The logging road I had taken didn't appear on any modern maps, and when I tried to trace my route again, everything looked just a little different, like the forest had rearranged itself. I've gone back to other abandoned places since then, but I don't go alone anymore. I always take someone with me, even if it's just to wait in the car. That experience didn't make me stop exploring, but it changed the way I move through places like that. I don't stay as long, I don't touch as much, and if I ever hear something that doesn't make sense, I leave. No hesitation, no second guessing. I don't have a clean explanation for what happened in that house. I've tried every logical angle I can think of. Old battery backups, signal bleed from somewhere else, auditory hallucination. None of it fits. None of it really explains the sound of someone breathing on the other end of a phone that hasn't had service in over a decade. And no matter how much time passes, I can't quite shake the feeling that I answered something that day I shouldn't have. That whatever was waiting on the other end of that line had been waiting for me. And it knew I was there. We moved into the farmhouse during the early days of September in 2019. arriving with the kind of cautious optimism that tends to accompany any significant change in life, especially when you're quietly hoping that a shift in geography might also bring about a change in everything else: your mood, your marriage, your way of seeing the world. The listing had described the place as historically preserved and gently aged, which, as it turned out, was a polite way of saying that the house was old enough to groan with every change in temperature and seemed to carry the weight of every decade it had endured in the grain of its wooden floors and the uneven plaster of its bowed walls. It was set back a good mile from the nearest road, surrounded on all sides by unkempt pasture land and clusters of stubborn, gnarled trees that pressed against the edges of the property like they had been waiting for decades to reclaim it. There was no one around for miles, and that isolation was part of what had drawn us there in the first place. We had been living in a cramped apartment in the city where the sound of footsteps above us and sirens below had begun to unravel our nerves. And we'd started to believe that what we needed, more than anything else, was silence and space. The farmhouse seemed to offer both in abundance. The air smelled like old soil and pine sap. The nights were starless and still. And the place had the sort of creaking, uneven charm that made it feel like it had settled into the land over the years, rather than having been built on top of it. The house had clearly aged without much interference. Everything inside appeared to be original. The floorboards, the thick wooden beams running along the ceiling, the ancient brass fixtures that cast strange shadows when the lights were on. Even the doors had that heavy, solid feel. The kind that groaned when opened and closed, with a reluctance that made you wonder what they'd seen sealed away in decades past. Yet, despite the strange beauty of the place, there was one detail that stood out from the rest, not because it was visually prominent, but because it had been so thoroughly and deliberately sealed. At the far end of the main hallway, just outside the two adjoining bedrooms, there was a square wooden hatch set flush into the floor. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a small access panel, perhaps for plumbing or storage. But upon closer inspection, it became painfully clear that someone had gone to considerable lengths to ensure that it remained shut. A length of corroded iron chain had been wound several times through the heavy steel handle. And a thick padlock, its metal scabbed over with rust and age, held the ends tightly together. Around the outer edge of the hatch, a series of crude, hand-hammered nails had been driven into the wood at haphazard angles, many of them bent, as if they had been forced into place in desperation rather than with care. During the brief walkthrough we were given before signing the lease, the owner, a tall, quiet man with a lined face and a habit of never quite meeting our eyes, offered little in the way of explanation other than to mention, in an almost dismissive tone, that the basement had suffered flood damage some years ago, and that the entire area had become unsafe for use, hence the need to restrict access completely. He didn't dwell on the subject, and we, eager to settle in and unwilling to complicate matters over what seemed like an inconsequential space beneath the floor, didn't press him for further detail. We assumed that whatever was down there was probably mold-ridden and structurally compromised, and while the severity of the ceiling seemed excessive, we chalked it up to rural caution and moved in without further thought. The first 24 hours passed without incident, though I do remember lying awake in bed that first night, unable to sleep, not because of any particular noise or concern, but because the house was so utterly, unnervingly quiet that my mind began to fill the silence with imaginary sounds, shifting wood, distant creaks, faint impressions of movement that I couldn't be sure I hadn't really heard. The second night, however, offered no such ambiguity. Somewhere just past midnight, as we were drifting in and out of sleep, a subtle but unmistakable tapping began to echo up through the floor. At first, it was barely audible, so faint that I thought it might have been the sound of tree branches brushing the side of the house, or perhaps a loose piece of siding shifting in the wind. But as the minutes passed, it grew clearer, more deliberate. It wasn't random or chaotic the way you'd expect if it had been an animal scurrying about. Instead, it was slow and rhythmic. 3 gentle knocks, each spaced about 2 seconds apart, followed by a long silence, and then another 3. There was something deeply human in the pattern, like the kind of knock you might use at someone's door if you didn't want to startle them. The sound returned again the following night, and again the night after that, each time slightly louder, and always from the same spot, the section of floor directly above the basement hatch. On the 4th morning, while passing through the hallway on my way to the kitchen, I noticed that the dust, which had previously formed an undisturbed film around the hatch, had been disrupted, smeared in a wide semicircular arc, as though something or someone beneath it had been pushing upward, dragging fingers or some other blunt object along the underside of the wood. One of the thick nails near the corner had worked itself halfway out, now jutting up from the floor at an angle, and the chain, which had once been pulled so tightly it had bit into the wood, now sagged ever so slightly, as though tension had been released. Although I had not touched it, and my partner hadn't gone near it either, the hatch appeared to have shifted on its own, and that fact settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake off. That night, as the tapping returned once more, louder now and accompanied by the slow, scraping drag of something heavy shifting below the floorboards, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling with my fists clenched beneath the blankets, unsure whether the cold I felt creeping on through the room was from the temperature or from something else entirely. The incident that finally pushed us past denial occurred on the 6th night, just past midnight, when a sudden, piercing metallic snap reverberated through the house like a thunderclap. It was followed immediately by a long, wrenching creak, the kind of strained, arthritic sound that ancient wood makes when being pried open under resistance. The noise came directly from the hallway. I didn't get up to check. I didn't even move. I stayed there until the sun came up, staring at the door with my breath held in my chest like a trapped animal waiting for a predator to pass. By the time daylight had finally crept into the hallway and the oppressive dark of night had begun to loosen its grip, I forced myself to confront what I had been dreading since the moment that sound had broken the stillness. I wasn't driven by bravery, not even close, but rather by that sinking, inescapable sense that whatever had happened during the night couldn't be ignored or wished away. When I reached the hatch, I saw that it was no longer sealed. The chain had been completely undone and now lay slumped across the boards in a coiled tangle. And the padlock, which had been rusted but intact only the day before, had been snapped apart as if someone or something had twisted it until the metal gave way. The bent nails that had once been wedged in so firmly around the edges had been pried loose from the wood, most of them pointing upward now in strange, crooked angles, as though the floor itself had been forced open from beneath. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, unsure of what terrified me more, the thought that someone had broken in from below, or the deeper, far worse fear that no one had. Eventually, with a flashlight shaking in my hand, I opened the hatch the rest of the way and aimed the beam down into the basement. What I saw wasn't dramatic. and that's part of what made it so difficult to process. There was no sign of flooding or structural damage. No burst pipes, no rotten beams. Just a narrow, steep staircase leading down into a cold, windowless space that looked more like a bunker than a basement. I stepped only far enough down the stairs to see the room clearly. It was empty. No shelves, no tools, no furniture, except for a stained, sagging mattress lying directly in the center of the concrete floor. The mattress looked old, like it had been left there years ago and forgotten. But it hadn't been undisturbed. The fabric was discolored, torn in places, and the stuffing had been pulled out in clumps, almost deliberately. The walls were damp with condensation, the kind that runs in long, slow rivulets down old brick, and the air smelled thick and sour, like mildew and something else I didn't want to name. There was no sound, no movement, but the stillness in that room didn't feel empty. It felt held, like the air itself was bracing for something, or like something had just been there and was now quietly hiding out of sight. I didn't go any farther. I didn't call out. I didn't take pictures or try to figure it out. I just climbed back up, shut the hatch, and walked away. We didn't argue about what to do next. There was no discussion, no weighing of options. We packed whatever we could grab in under an hour, just enough to fill the back of the car, and left everything else behind. Furniture, clothes, food in the fridge, the lease, all of it. We left the house in the early afternoon and didn't stop driving until we were 3 counties over. I didn't care about the deposit. I didn't care what the landlord might say. I just needed to be gone from that place. He called a couple times during the week that followed. I never picked up. I couldn't bring myself to hear his voice, couldn't stomach the thought of him asking questions, or worse, pretending like he didn't know why we had left. I deleted the voicemails without listening. I never reported what we found. I didn't even tell anyone, not in detail anyway, because I knew how it would sound. I've never been back to that part of Tennessee, and I don't plan to. To this day, I don't know what was really down there. Maybe it was just an old mattress in a neglected basement. Maybe it was something else. Something that didn't want to be locked away anymore. But I do know this. In the end, it wasn't what I saw that convinced me to leave. It was what I didn't see. That silence, that waiting, that feeling that I had arrived a moment too late to witness something I was never supposed to understand. And when I think back on it now, I don't wonder what was in that basement. I wonder if it ever left. I had gone out to Missouri in the spring of 2022 to stay with my cousin, who had been living on an aging family farm tucked far off the rural grid, the kind of place that didn't appear on any tourist map and barely showed up on satellite images unless you zoomed all the way in. The farm itself was modest, consisting of a weathered 2-story house with uneven floors that creaked beneath your feet, a low fence that had once served to separate livestock but now sagged in places under the slow weight of time, and a barn that sat apart from the rest of the structures like a sentinel no longer standing guard, but merely observing. My cousin wasn't farming in any serious capacity, at least not anymore. The fields hadn't been properly cultivated in years. The animals were mostly limited to a few hens and a temperamental goat, and the rest of the land had surrendered itself to nature, with wild grasses reclaiming the ground where tractors used to pass. I had accepted the offer to stay there, not out of any desire to reconnect with country life or relive some faded childhood memory, but because I had reached a point in my own existence where everything around me in the city, the job that offered no meaning, the apartment that echoed with a kind of sterile silence, the relationships that had withered under neglect and fatigue, had begun to feel unbearable in a quiet and constant way, like an itch under the skin that you can't ever quite reach. My cousin's farm offered something the city no longer could: distance, obscurity, and above all, silence. I didn't ask how long I could stay, and he didn't set a deadline. We both seemed to understand that I needed space more than structure. The barn, standing roughly 200 feet away from the house and slightly downhill, was the oldest building on the property, with planks of gray wood that had been warped and softened by decades of rain and summer heat, and a roof that had once been painted a deep red but now looked more like rust stretched across a peaked frame. There were two wide lower doors, secured with a heavy chain during storms, and an upper window in the hayloft that sat half open at an odd angle. The result of years of warping and sun damage, permanently stuck that way unless someone went up there to force it shut. That hayloft hadn't been used in years. The ladder leading up to it had been removed after a local boy broke his arm falling from it, and there was no electricity running to the building anymore, which left the whole structure feeling like an abandoned set from another time. For the first week of my stay, the farm lived up to every promise I had projected onto it. It was quiet in the way only isolated places can be, with the kind of silence that magnifies every small sound and makes you aware of your own breathing, your own thoughts, in a way the noise of civilization never does. I spent most days helping my cousin with small repairs, clearing brush, and trying not to think too deeply about the reasons I had come there. In the evenings, I would sit on the back steps of the house with a cup of something warm, watching the last blue traces of daylight fade behind the trees while the barn stood in silhouette, unmoving and solid, like a landmark frozen in a time no longer connected to mine. It was on one of those evenings, roughly 10 days into my stay, that I noticed something strange, something that didn't fit the order of things as I had come to understand them. I had gone outside as usual, expecting nothing but the wind and the sound of insects rising in waves through the field, when I saw a flicker of light in the hayloft window. At first, it was so brief that I thought I might have imagined it. Just a glint or a trick of moonlight bouncing off something reflective. But then it came again. This time, some softer, like the glow from a candle being shielded by someone's hand, rising and falling at irregular intervals, flickering just enough to be noticed and just weak enough to leave doubt in its wake. There was no power in that barn, no wiring that extended to the upper level, and certainly no reason for a light to be visible from the hayloft, which was supposed to be sealed off and completely inaccessible. I stood there watching for a while, waiting to see it again, and when nothing else happened after several minutes, I returned inside. Not because I felt reassured, but because I wasn't yet ready to ask myself the questions that moment had stirred. I didn't mention it the next day, not to my cousin or in passing conversation, because to name it would have been to acknowledge it. And at that point, I still believed, or wanted to believe, that the simplest answer, however flawed, was probably the right one. It was the morning after that when I decided to go out to the barn and take a closer look for myself, driven less by curiosity and more by a need to quiet the feeling that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. The interior of the barn was cool and smelled of old hay, motor oil, and the dry scent of wood that had absorbed too many seasons. Sunlight pushed on through the cracks in the walls and thin slants that moved across the dust, and everything inside was still, unmoved, untouched. Or so it first appeared. It wasn't until I looked up toward the edge of the loft that I noticed the pattern of the hay above looked irregular, flattened in some places, almost disturbed. That detail alone wouldn't have meant much, except there hadn't been a way into that loft for years. Not unless someone climbed or hoisted themselves using the interior support beams. I took my time getting up there, using a wooden brace nailed to the side and then swinging myself onto one of the broad support beams to reach the ledge. A process that left my palms scraped and my heart racing. Not from the effort, but from the creeping knowledge that I was going somewhere someone else had already been. When I finally got up into the loft and turned to face the corner near the left wall, I found something I hadn't expected to see. A faded green wool blanket, bundled and wrinkled as though someone had slept on it recently, with patches of it pressed flat against the hay beneath in the unmistakable shape of a human form. There was no trash, no water bottle or bag, no personal belongings of any kind. Just the blanket and the lingering scent of something damp and unclean, like sweat trapped in fabric and left to rot quietly. It was the kind of scene that felt incomplete but heavy with implication. The kind that doesn't need to explain itself to make your stomach tighten. I climbed down slowly, with that same uncomfortable sense of being watched, though the barn remained silent around me. That evening, I finally told my cousin what I had seen, describing the blanket, the disturbed hay, and the light I had noticed 2 nights earlier. He didn't say much, just stood there for a long moment before nodding quietly, and said he'd clear it out later. It wasn't the words that stuck with me, but the look on his face, that subtle flicker of recognition, not rooted in surprise, but in something deeper, like maybe this wasn't the first time something strange had happened in that barn. It was sometime not long after, maybe 2 nights later, when I woke just after 3 in the morning to the sudden, jarring sound of the barn doors slamming shut. The kind of sharp, violent noise that instantly cuts through sleep and doesn't leave room for confusion. I sat up so fast that for a moment I felt lightheaded, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard, and before I even realized what I was doing, I was already at the window, my hand pushing the curtain aside with slow, deliberate fingers. Out across the field, the barn stood in full view under the pale wash of moonlight, and though the doors were still partially open, they now hung unevenly, swaying back and forth like they'd been thrown wide by force and left to drift on their own. But it wasn't the state of the barn that held my attention. It was the figure walking away from it, just moving steadily through the tall grass, heading toward the line of trees at the far edge of the property without so much as a glance backward. Even at a distance, I could see that the person was tall and thin, dressed in loose, dark clothing that shifted slightly in the wind with every step. There was something in the way they moved that didn't feel rushed or panicked, or even like they were trying to get away with anything. They were just walking, slow and steady, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and didn't care who might be watching. In their right hand, held low at their side, was something long and narrow that caught the light in rhythmic flashes as they walked. Metallic, maybe a blade, something that swung slightly with their stride and gleamed in that flat, silver way moonlit steel tends to. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched, gripping the edge of the curtain in my hand until my knuckles went pale, half expecting them to turn or stop or disappear entirely. But they didn't. They just kept walking until the tree line swallowed them whole. and then the barn and the yard were still again. The silence deeper now than before, like the world had taken a breath and was holding it. The next morning, we called the county sheriff's office, and an officer came out a few hours later to take a look. He walked the length of the barn, checked the locks, stepped up into the loft, and asked us the same basic questions you'd expect. Had we seen anyone before? Was anything stolen? Had there been any prior incidents? He took a few photos of the blanket that was still there in the loft, logged a brief report, and told us he'd file it under a suspicious trespassing incident unless something else came up. There weren't any footprints that could be clearly traced. The ground was too dry, and what few impressions existed could have belonged to any of us. There were no signs of forced entry, no vandalism, and nothing obviously stolen or left behind beyond what I had already found. I left the following morning, not because I had a pressing appointment or because I had changed my mind about staying, but because something in the air out there had shifted, and I no longer felt like I could rest easy on that land, not with the image of that figure still walking away burned into the back of my mind. I didn't give my cousin a long explanation, and he didn't press me for one. He just nodded once, quietly, like he understood more than he was willing to say. Since returning to my apartment, I've tried to push it aside, tried to convince myself that whoever had stayed up there, in the loft, was probably just a drifter, someone looking for shelter and nothing more. But it's hard to believe that when I replay that moment in my head, standing in front of the window, staring out across the open field, and watching a stranger walk away without a trace of urgency, as if what had happened that night didn't require an escape, only an exit. It wasn't the fear of being seen that drove them. It was something else entirely, something colder. What still unsettles me most isn't what I saw that night, but the realization that we may never know how long they had been there. How many nights they watched the house from just above our heads, silent and unnoticed, waiting for something we never got to understand. And that blanket in the loft? That wasn't dropped in a hurry or left behind by mistake. It was left folded in the corner, as if someone knew they wouldn't be needing it anymore. It was during the summer of 2020, when much of the world felt suspended in a strange and heavy silence, that I found myself spending 2 weeks alone on my uncle's remote farm in the far reaches of Nebraska. A sprawling piece of land buried deep in open country where the flat landscape stretched in every direction like an endless sheet of faded green parchment, broken only by miles of cornfields that stood tall and whispering under the unbroken dome of the sky. My uncle, who had always been a quiet man with simple routines, had asked me to house sit while he traveled to Colorado to visit his daughter. And I agreed without hesitation, imagining it would be a welcome retreat from the noise and anxiety of the time. A chance to disconnect, breathe, and revisit a place that had always carried a certain nostalgic weight from childhood summers spent chasing fireflies in the dusk and listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of nature as night settled across the land. The house itself was a weathered but solid 2-story structure, built decades ago in a time when homes were made to last through storms and seasons without complaint. Its once white paint now faded and peeling at the edges like brittle parchment. The wood beneath gray and splintered from years of exposure to wind, sun, and rain. Inside, the floors creaked beneath every step as though the home remembered every footfall that had passed through it. and the air carried the distinct scent of aged timber mingled faintly with old dust, dry soil, and a sharp trace of iron that seemed to emanate from the aging pipes. My days were slow and uneventful in the beginning, marked by simple routines. Feeding the handful of barn cats that lingered near the shed, checking the locks on the chicken coop, even though there hadn't been livestock in years, and spending long hours on the back porch as the horizon darkened, watching the sun dissolve into shades of rust and blood behind the cornfields that bordered the property like tall, unmoving walls. The silence of the place, once something I had always associated with calm, began to take on a different tone as the days wore on, shifting from peaceful solitude to a kind of watchful stillness that made me feel, at times, like I wasn't alone, though I had not seen another soul since I arrived. It was on the fourth evening, as the last of the light drained from the sky and a band of copper-colored clouds stretched low above the field, that I first saw the figure, a tall and unmoving silhouette standing far back among the rows of corn, just barely visible from where I sat on the porch. Its presence so out of place and unnervingly still that it took several moments for my mind to register that it was not a scarecrow, not a shadow, and not something explained by memory or familiarity. The figure was positioned deep enough into the field that only the upper part of its body rose above the stalks. But there was no mistaking the distinctly human outline, nor the sense that it was standing directly facing the house, perfectly upright and without the slightest twitch of movement, as if it had been carved from the air itself and rooted in place for some unfathomable reason. I continued to watch it, feeling the breath in my lungs grow tight and shallow, not out of panic, but from a creeping certainty that whatever stood there was not behaving in any way that aligned with a trespasser, a prankster, or even a lost traveler. The figure did not move, did not gesture, did not shift its weight in the slightest. And as I sat frozen in my seat with my gaze locked on that unbroken silhouette, I began to feel an overwhelming tension building in the space between us, as though the air itself had taken on weight, stretching thinner and thinner, like a cord pulled too tight. And then, in the instant that I looked to the side, just briefly, whether to blink or to convince myself I hadn't imagined it, I turned my eyes back and found the field empty again. The rows of corn swaying softly in the evening wind, undisturbed and silent, as if nothing had ever broken their rhythm. The following morning, once the safety of daylight had returned and the unease had dulled into something more manageable, I ventured out into the field, compelled not by bravery, but by the persistent and uncomfortable need to ground what I had seen in something physical, something explainable, even if that explanation turned out to be mundane. I walked slowly, scanning the rows for broken stalks, displaced soil, or any sign that someone had moved through the space during the night. But the corn stood tall and untouched, its leaves brushing against my arms with the same dry, papery texture as always. And the dirt beneath my boots was compact, smooth, and empty of tracks. There were no signs of disturbance, no boot prints, no cigarette butts, no discarded clothing or gear, just the quiet, the heat, and the sense that I had walked into a place where something had been, but left nothing behind. I did my best to push the encounter from my thoughts, convincing myself that what I had seen could have easily been the result of fatigue, the oppressive summer heat, or simply my mind playing tricks after too many days spent in total solitude, far removed from the ordinary structure and noise of daily life. That kind of rationalization worked for a little while. But the illusion of normalcy didn't survive the next morning. When I stepped outside just after dawn, and noticed something that I knew hadn't been that way the night before. The old wooden bench that had always sat under the gnarled oak tree beside the house, a fixture so heavy it usually took 2 people to move, had been shifted several feet from where it normally rested, its legs leaving shallow impressions through the grass and soil in a curved path, repositioned with just enough care that it now faced directly toward the cornfield, as though someone had wanted a clearer view. Nearby, the aluminum folding chair I had left propped against the porch wall had also been relocated. Not knocked over, not carelessly dropped, but placed several yards out into the open yard in a way that felt purposeful. It now sat perfectly square to the rows of corn, its back legs pressed into the ground, just enough to suggest someone had been sitting in it for a while. There was nothing else disturbed. No footprints in the soft dirt, no drag marks, no cigarette butts or beer cans, or any of the signs that would point to a trespasser looking to cause trouble or pass time. It wasn't what was there that bothered me most. It was what was missing. Whoever had done this had moved with intent and with silence, leaving behind only the arrangements, like a silent message meant to be understood without words. Later that afternoon, still uneasy and unable to let it go, I called the local sheriff's office. Not out of panic, but because I needed to know whether anything like this had happened to anyone else, whether I was the only one. The deputy who picked up was polite and professional, but his tone carried that familiar undercurrent of practiced detachment, the kind you hear from people who've grown used to strange calls and even stranger explanations. He told me, almost casually, that a few people in the area had reported similar things over the years. Figures seen standing in the cornfields right around dusk, always quiet, always gone by the time anyone went to look. They had followed up on some of those reports, sent a cruiser out now and then, but they never found anyone, and nothing ever came of it. He offered the usual theories: transients passing through, kids playing pranks, the light messing with people's depth perception. But none of it really addressed what I had seen, and none of it explained the objects being moved with such precision, without leaving a single trace behind. I didn't argue. I just thanked him, hung up, and sat there for a long while, staring out at the corn. When my uncle returned at the end of the second week, I didn't share every detail. I mentioned the figure I thought I'd seen, the way the bench had been moved, the chair, the odd feeling that someone had been nearby while I slept. He listened quietly, didn't laugh or question me, but he also didn't ask for more. And when he stepped out onto the porch that evening and looked out toward the field without saying a word, just standing there for a few long moments before going back inside, I got the sense that he wasn't as surprised as I'd expected him to be. I haven't been back to that farm since. Life moved on, as it always does. But I carry that experience with me, tucked just beneath the surface, ready to rise at the most unexpected times. Sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas, passing those long stretches of empty road lined with towering cornfields that look almost identical to the one behind my uncle's house, I catch myself glancing toward the rows, looking just a little too hard at the spaces between them, half expecting to see that same unmoving shape watching from the shadows. I still don't know what I saw that night. I can't prove it happened. But I know it wasn't a person just passing through. And I know it wasn't my imagination either. There was something out there. Something that didn't make noise, didn't leave evidence, and didn't need to move quickly because it wasn't afraid of being seen. It stood there for as long as it wanted, and it came close enough to rearrange the world around me without making a sound. Whatever it was It knew exactly what it was doing. And worst of all, it wanted me to know it had been there.